This corner of our studio garden is dominated by a magnificent walnut tree. The tree itself has a beautiful form and provides excellent shade below for planting. However, planting beneath a walnut tree can be a little bit tricky. The trees produce a chemical called juglone in their roots that can be fatal to other plants. This provides walnut trees with an edge in competing for water and nutrients with other plants around it. This is great if you're a walnut tree, but can be problematic if you're a gardener trying to beautify the space below your walnut. Luckily, there are several plants that are well adapted to the juglone and even tolerant of it. These include perennials such as hosta species, Solomon's seal, and lamb's ear, some trees and shrubs such as the Japanese maple, red buds, and the rose of Sharon, and some annual plants including fibrous begonia species and many of the zinnia species. We have a number of hosta cultivars planted beneath our walnut. However, the planting itself lacks structure and organization. We want to redesign this area to create a nice hosta walk. We also would like to add a pathway through it. Right now, the only area to view the garden is from the outside, and this doesn't allow us to get very close to the vast majority of cultivars planted in here. So by adding a pathway, we could allow visitors to get up closer to more of the cultivars. To start the design process, I usually begin with a garden hose and a bunch of empty planting containers. And I use these to lay out my structure. I begin laying out my pathway by walking several different patterns through the garden. This helps me identify any possible obstacles that might be in the way. It also helps me work around existing trees. Do I want to curve around a nice shrub? It helps me incorporate those. But I also want to look around me outside of the garden, especially at points where the path enters and exits. Are there beautiful views that we might be able to capture by simply moving our entryway over a few feet? In a small open space, often our views don't vary significantly, but in a larger bed, especially one where there's a lot of structure, those views at the entrance and exit can vary significantly. Once I've identified the general layout, I start to use some hoses. I bring just regular garden hoses in and I lay them out throughout the bed. And this helps me get a little bit better idea of where I want my path to be. Now in this space we have a fairly large area and I wanted to divide it into smaller sections. And I thought of dividing the front section being about 2/3 of the total area and the section behind our new path being 1/3. And the reason for this is this large area can actually be considered a two-sided garden. We can view the front half of it from our outer walkway and the back half of it from our new walkway. The final third is viewed from inside the pathway. As you're designing any space, there's a number of small decisions that need to be made. A good example in our garden was when we were laying out our path. At first we thought it would be very nice if we lined it up with this existing path coming from our herb garden. But as we laid it out, we realized the path would then be far too close to our magnolia, which is just going to continue to grow into the pathway. So we decided to shift our entrance over a bit. A common mistake in designing a pathway is in the way that two paths intersect. A lot of times people have pathways intersect at angles, and this causes small areas with a real sharp angle. We end up with this small patch of ground that can be difficult to plant. If this were a turf area, you're going to have a real narrow strip of turf that can be difficult to manage. We also find that as people walk the path, they tend to cut that corner anyway, and the plants or turf in this area get very worn out. The correct solution for this is to have your pathways meet at right angles, and we do this whether we have a curvilinear path or a rectilinear path. It works for both, but this will help reduce problems with management. Another decision we need to make in our design process is how does this garden relate to other areas in the landscape? At this end, we're very close to our sun perennial garden, and we contemplated whether or not we wanted to add a path down to access the hosta garden from down there, but we thought it would be better to seclude and isolate this garden and make it its own private space. We'll do that by adding some plantings on this side to close it in. We also saw a very natural place for a seating area. Once this is closed in, it'll be nice to have a private little seating area. Oftentimes you could find natural recesses in your landscape. In a home setting, these are often in corners of the yard. But this allows us to have a private space for sitting. Another decision we want to make is the form of our pathway. Do we want it to be rectilinear or curvilinear? Since we're in this more woodland setting, we decided a curvilinear path would be best. One of the benefits of using the hose as you lay out your pathway is that you can look at it from outside of the garden, and this helps you identify lines of vision, and especially where you might want to place a focal point. We have a really ideal place down our entrance path where it splits off into two. There's a wonderful spot to put a focal point, and so I marked this location by setting a container with a flag that reminds me I want something rather spectacular here. I also want to start adding a little bit of structure to the garden, and I do this by putting out just empty containers, and I use these to represent shrubs or trees in my landscape, and I use these because they're lightweight, they're easy to move around. And in the large section of our bed, I thought it would be very good to add some structure both for winter interest. Remember, hostas will go dormant and they're only up for about 6 months out of the year. So I want something in here of interest year-round. I also want to break up this large space, and I do that by adding a small grouping of shrubs on either side of our walnut tree. Now as we come in, the entrance path, it curves to the side. Curves and paths are wonderful to create a sense of mystery. As the path moves out of your line of sight, you want to follow that and see what's around that bend. But our space is very wide open, and even though the path curves, you could still see what's around it. So I thought it would be very good to add a large, taller shrub on this corner, which would create that sense of enclosure and mystery. Now the final thing I wanted to do as we added structure was think about that mid-story layer. If you walk through a woodland, you have your upper canopy of trees, and then you have a lower canopy from your understory trees, and then finally the ground layer of herbaceous plants and smaller shrubs. Now we have one understory tree, but I wanted to add a few more, which I've marked by putting flags out in our bed. We're going to continue to work on our hosta garden over the next few weeks. In the meantime, I need to take an inventory of what cultivars we have present and how large they grow, and do a little bit of research on some of the other cultivars that I want to add to the garden.